I've got this big video called Practical Creativity that I released on my Trixie the Golden Witch channel recently. And in it, I sort of slyly mentioned that a big part of why I talk about anime so often is that it is kind of easy. It's like an easy springboard into getting to dive into really just whatever topic the anime brings up. And so during a long period of time where I couldn't really identify what specifically I was trying to get out of anime, just that it was hard for me to consume other stuff. It just, for some reason, like the meta context of anime made it easier for me to get lost in that world. But I didn't really know what specifically was I looking for there, so I tended to engage with shows just as they came to me and talk about whatever stood out. And sometimes that could be super deep and meaningful. Sometimes it could be my first time ever exploring an idea. Sometimes it could be an idea that I've explored so thoroughly that I feel like I'm making an authoritative statement about it. But this pretty much all revolved around the idea that anime was like somehow singularly the only thing that could get through to me. And granted, I've always been even more into music than I am into anime, but I find it even more difficult to talk about music without knowing specifically like what is being done by the musicians, which can be very difficult to describe. With animation, even if I can't describe literally what's being done by the animators, at the very least I can talk about the writing, which tends to be at the core of what people really like about the shows. And through anime, I studied writing until a point of really feeling like I understand it. And I don't feel like I necessarily understand animation. Like, I know the basics of how it's done. I could not break down any amount of animation technique for you. So in a way, choosing animation as my main field of discussion is really odd, because it kind of isn't something I really know that much about. But at the same time, I don't think that anime is really something you get into because you necessarily love animation, like specifically, because it's not often the best showcase of animation. And really using anime as a showcase of animation is like as something that it's a popular and trendy is almost more recent. Like the Sakuga boom really took off in the 2010s, where people are trying to show off what they can do as animators. Not that they haven't always been, but just that the way that it's perceived publicly is different. It used to be animators trying to impress one another. Now animators are trying to impress the public in a way that the public had no way of expressing appreciation for until more recently. And so while I do appreciate like great animation technique, what I really love about anime is its ability to explore incredibly specific emotions. It's not about how animated it is. It's not about the techniques in terms of how difficult they are or like how impressive they are, but how do they communicate the emotions of the story? And I'm somebody who tends to learn on a visual and an audio level. So audiovisual media will hit me the hardest every time. I grew up watching like sing-alongs and music videos, and that's how I learned to read, to write, to speak. I learned all of that from sing-along. So the closer a piece of media is to that, the more I'm going to understand it. It's why I get so much of my education from rap music, I think. Now, anime does kind of have the vibe of sing-along because there is an ever-presence of music and sound effects that are kind of guiding the experience. It is, first and foremost, like a radio performance. Like, in the case of anime in particular, there's such a disconnect between the recording experience on the audio end and the creation experience on the visual end that it's really like two different creative processes being merged together from departments that often have nothing to do with each other at all. There's no creative connection between the animation and the voicing or sound departments. But there is some level on which they all know what's going on and they're all operating on the same logic. And if there's good direction, you know, as long as the directors understand what's happening, they can keep all these departments working together. That's kind of what makes a director so important, is that they know what's happening between the departments and how it all gels together, how it all should gel together. So in that way, anime is like one part sound novel, one part like picture book. I think that there's no animation studio that understands anime this way better than Studio Shaft. And anybody who has their career, through their career, has been influenced by Akiyuki Shinbo, I think that Shinbo looked at anime and all of the techniques that had been developed in order to create drama with like minimal budget, minimal manpower, with minimal ability to actually do anything, and basically said, like, how do we maximize the effect of that? Where a lot of these creators are really trying to make the most that they can, and in the process of dumbing that down, they arrive at what anime is. He was like, how do I dumb it down even more while pumping up that effect? Like, do it more on purpose, like make it more effective on purpose instead of just by accident. I really think that's the Shaft approach. And it's not that they never try to impress, because usually the first episodes of their shows or, key moments will have crazy animation, but oftentimes it shows up late. You have to wait till the Blu-ray before it really looks like that. But a lot of the time their shows are kind of slideshows, but the slideshow looks awesome, and the audio performance is always stellar. There's always voice actors who are deeply experienced, who understand the characters, who are able to bring out the idea of what the story is just through their performances, and then the visuals are marrying that and are so outlandishly striking that it's hard not to remember both things at once. Like, the way the audio is and the way the video is are both so particular that you will definitely remember seeing and hearing the same thing at the same time. If you need the perfect example, think of Sayonara Zetsubo Sensei, how in almost every episode Sensei does this thing where he looks off in each of the four directions and he goes ksh, 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 and then he says Zetsubo shita. It's his gimmick, and if you know the show, you know exactly the pacing of it, exactly the way it looks, exactly the way it sounds, because it is just an absolutely perfect encapsulation of the emotion that it's trying to convey. And it's using all of the power of audio-visual presentation to create that emotion with the minimal effort, really. It's well animated, but it's literally so little to have to animate, and it shows up in every episode as though it were this tremendously impressive piece of animation. But again, that's not the point of it. It's so effective. It's just such an emotionally effective thing that every time Sensei reaches this emotion, which is like what the show is built around. It's built around pushing him to this point and then him exploding. And so it's memorable every single time it happens. You're like, here it comes. Here comes Zetsubo Shita. He's going to be in despair about something. Let's go. Now the train has left the rails. When the author of Sangatsu no Lion described why she wanted Studio Shaft to adapt her manga, she basically talks about this sort of intrusiveness that Shinbo has into the emotions of the characters, that he's always pushing all the way into their feelings in a way that is clearly making the character, even themselves, uncomfortable. That, like, on screen there is a sense of the character is uncomfortable with how they are being revealed by the animation. And that unique feeling that she got, particularly from Monogatari, was what inspired her to want that, because she felt like that is what she was also doing with her manga, is always kind of flirting with this idea that she's pushing a little too far into the characters' emotions than they would want for you to see. And she wanted them to even use like Akio Watanabe character designs, and Shinbo had to like sit her down and say, your fans will kill us if it doesn't look like the manga, so we're not doing that. Like there's like this is a money making franchising empire first and foremost. And that's another thing Shinbo's a master of, is he never forgets that like making a product for the audience comes first. This is a consumer product. I work for the higher-ups. I work for the big money at the top. And that's the part that has made anime really tough for me to keep wanting to talk about. I hate the way the industry is run. Studio Shaft and Shinbo, they're trying to make do with what they've got, but it's not like they don't know how to make it better for everyone other than in the creative, expressive way. Like, it's more fun to work for a studio where even if the working conditions are just as bad as every other studio, at least you get to really leave your mark on the series. And I think that's Shinbo's mentality with Shaft. And it's not like he runs the studio either. You know, he's just the creative director of it. But the mentality is, okay, you know, if we're going to deal with these intense deadlines, if we're going to deal with it being this way, here's how we make that fun for ourselves. But, like, there's been so much crunch with the studio, and there's been so many times that production fell behind, and there's been these massive staff exodus. It makes it hard to talk about these shows and celebrate them and to be like, oh, yeah, you should go back and watch this show that, yeah, maybe it's really good and it will be enriching for you on a personal level, but is that a better use of your time than to go consume something that actually isn't supporting some kind of like evil machine, you know, that doesn't feel like you're feeding into this addiction to this like dissociative habit that just perpetuates, really, to me, negativity, you know, like to celebrate anime holistically as like something that you just need to throw your support at in order for it to exist is it's selfish, you know. And like I think that a lot of animators really don't understand how badly they're fucking themselves over. And so I feel like this kind of sense of dread in like encouraging people to participate in this industry, knowing that it's not an industry that's going to protect you. And I know that firsthand just because of how much I've had to fight to just talk positively about anime. That making videos celebrating great shows gets me copyright strikes and gets me in trouble with these industries that want to have total control over how their shows are represented. And whether it's positive or negative, they just don't like that someone is able to control the narrative about this product that they're just desperate to sell because their margins are so fucking slim. And it's like, this is just not a way to operate. This isn't a way for an industry to be. So when it comes to celebrating anime, I really want to celebrate it on the messaging level of like, yes, anime has been good. Good things have happened. Good creative ideas, good messaging, good things exist in the medium of anime. But I can't talk about it in a way that doesn't acknowledge that, like, that doesn't mean you should go throw all your money at it. Or it doesn't mean that you should, like, go watch it on the legal streaming site because, you know, you got to support the industry. No, you don't. You really shouldn't, in my opinion. And, like, if you can find it in you to go explore things besides anime, I would love that. I rewatched the first episode of Arakawa Under the Bridge on Tubi because that's just what came up in the Google search, and I was mostly trying to see what it would be like to connect my laptop to this big TV that my brother left behind when he moved out of his house that I have at the foot of the bed. I was like, let's see what the watching anime at the foot of the bed experience is, and it was delightful. I love the first episode of Arakawa Under the Bridge. And that's in part because of Shaft's magnificent presentation. When I put on the first episode, the first thing that my husband said, he wasn't paying attention, he was watching something else, but I put it on and he went, "What is this? Is this new? It looks new." And I went, "Nope." It's 15 years old. That's the sad state. At least 15 years old, I think. I think it came out in 2010 or 2011. I can't remember which. That's just the state of anime, is that, but it's also because Shaft shows age very well because they don't look like any era of anime, you know? Like, I know that it isn't new, but there's no reason to think that it couldn't be based on how it looks, because anime doesn't look so much better than this all the time. And if anything, it very often looks much worse just on a design level. You know, it's not that the show looks technologically new. It's that anything looking really good and not technologically old reads as new because it should. Like, ideally, this is what new things would look like. And again, it's not for any kind of like real specialty in the animation quality of this episode. There is a lot of animation in this episode compared to what I know I'm going to get later because it's a Shaft anime, but it's not like a ton of crazy stuff. There's a couple of moments they really threw in on just for the hell of it. I know I'm not going to be coming to this show for animation based on this episode. I'm coming to it for the very particular dynamic of the characters, the way that the comedy routine is set up. And it's one of those episodes as well that is kind of singular because regardlessly how the rest of the show is going to play out, this episode does its moral parable so well that even if you do not watch the rest of the show, you could take this as like a short film, and I think it totally tells a complete story. It is by itself, to me, a like 10 out of 10 episode. And I don't mean 10 out of 10 like, oh my god, it's mind-blowing, it's the greatest anime episode you're ever going to see. I just think, like, in terms of doing what it does, there's no notes. Like, I don't think it could be done better. Everything about it felt exactly right. Even the way that it has the ending theme pretty significantly before the end of the episode. But, like, for pacing reasons, that works out extremely well. It handles being an adaptation of, like, a gag manga better than almost anything else, especially in terms of first episode pacing. K-on's first episode could not touch this first episode on the pacing level in terms of adapting that type of comedy to animation. The reason I love Arakawa Under the Bridge so much, aside from having one of the all-time greatest opening themes ever, if you've never heard it, punch yourself in the face. Aside from how awesome it is on a visual level, it's a show about the main character learning a lesson the hard way that I also had to learn the hard way, which is I'm going to describe as how to turn your border to gratitude. What the fuck do I mean by that, other than that I'm quoting a Sound of Animals Fighting lyric? The main character of Arakawa Under the Bridge, whose name is literally slipping my mind. I don't think anyone has been established as Arakawa in the first episode, actually. The main dude is a man entirely governed by the concept of debt. Anything anyone does for you must be paid back absolutely. You can never be in debt to anybody. This was instilled in him on a level where his dad, when he was 8 years old, made him raise his dad like a baby. Like, his dad put on like a bib and sat in a stroller and was like, you have to now take care of me for the next 8 years the way that I took care of you for the last 8 years. So that was the start of him paying off all his debts. So he's been so traumatized by this mentality that if he cannot pay back a debt, like he cannot feel as though he's paid back a debt, he starts having asthma attacks and like he'll literally die. So if he can't pay back every single debt, he will die. And in the effort of always being able to pay off a debt, he therefore is like this extremely successful business person. He's very rich, he inherited his father's business, and he basically regards himself as this very well-off, privileged, like individual who because they live by this powerful ethos is therefore like altruistic and virtuous, like, oh, I have no debts to anyone, therefore I'm a great person, is essentially the way this guy thinks, on top of having, all this money and opportunity that backs up that mentality. But the first episode starts with him having just been randomly pantsed by like teenagers on a bridge, and his pants are now hanging from these rafters. And there's a girl fishing off of the bridge who says, I can throw my line up there and get those pants for you real quick. And, we should believe her because it's a cartoon. And he's like, no, I can't be in debt. So he goes and tries to climb the steel girder up the bridge to get the pants, and the girder breaks and the bridge he falls into the river. The girl saves his life, and now he's like, I have to repay this literally every breath I take for the rest of my life is now a debt to you. So I have to do something massive for you, or else I'm going to die, based on how my anxiety works. And so she says, you have to be my lover then. And the implication of this being he has to live under the bridge with her. She's not really looking for anything sexual or anything really more than, I guess, just the idea of him as a lover. And she kind of lets him decide what that entails while subtly manipulating him, because he's very easy to send into his thoughts and his idea of what debt is. And so a lot of their relationship as the show goes on, and it's only explored a little bit in this episode, but you can get the hints that she is basically trolling him about his way of thinking. Like, she understands that this way of thinking is going to kill this man, that this is just not a way to view life. And it's so opposite of the way she lives her life that the best thing she can do for him is to kind of slowly unravel his way of thinking and reveal to him that, like, you are not who you think you are. You know, like, your way of doing things is not giving, you are not as happy as you think. Because if the mere thought of someone doing something nice for you and you not immediately finding a way to pay that back sends you into cardiac arrest, you're living your life wrongly, you know? So there's this kind of subtle idea that she's like kind of fucking with him because she sees how he's making his own life difficult. She wouldn't have had to jump into River to save him if he had just asked her to fucking throw up the line, you know? So, like, he's really creating his own problems by not being willing to ask for help. But he doesn't see this at all. He does not see how, you know, how making the situation worse and then needing help is worse than just asking for it in the first place. On the subject of what the Sangatsu no Lion manga author had said about the way Shaft probes into their characters, with this show, with the main guy, you're constantly getting his train of thought. It's the same voice actor who plays Araragi in Monogatari, so if you're used to that performance, you'll immediately understand, like, the rambling, highly interior, like, the mind of a character who's always thinking, which is something I really took for granted in early anime viewing, like, shows like this, because I just thought that's how everybody thinks. And so I thought that there are just some shows that just decide to share all of the characters' thoughts, and some shows that just decide not to, and not really regarding the idea that, like, not everyone just thinks all the time. Not everybody has a constant train of thought. And for some people, their train of thought literally sounds like the Tatami Galaxy, which is a little faster than how my interiority is. Mine, there's a lot of music involved and repetition and a lot of different things, you know, actually. The interior of my mind feels more like something like the Lane experience, but that wasn't something I understood as an attempt to express interiority when I first saw it as a kid. It's something I only understood later, of like, oh, the world feels so weird because this is how Lane is experiencing the world. This is her sensory experience of what reality is. And so with Shaft, they're always trying to give you that, but it's so ADHD. It always bounces between all the characters and tries to give you really a very holistic perspective on how everybody's feeling about everything all the time, you know? But with this show, it's interesting because, again, the main character, we go all the way in on his thoughts, but the girl, I think she's just being called, like, no in the first episode, something simple, because it's like whatever the number is on her shirt. I can't remember. There's this sense with her that she isn't thinking like that. She isn't neurotic. She isn't puzzling over everything, but she is having realizations. And so every once in a while there's just a close-up on her eyes and her kind of shifting expression, usually in reaction to something that he just said. And then based on the way that she starts acting from then on, we can kind of get a sense of what was she thinking. And the answer is usually that just something he says clearly set wrong with her, that, like, she hears in what he's saying a cry for help that is coded. Oh, you're wrong, so you need help. You know, like it's her realizing that over and over again. Oh, your mentality is wrong, so therefore you need me to approach you a different way. And you can see her realizing that. Even if that's not like a sentence that's formulating in her head, you can understand that's what's happening because of what happens, you know, because you see that shift in expression and then you see how she changes her behavior. So I feel like I understand the character even without getting that level of actual dialogue in her mind, because I don't think there is that level of actual dialogue in her mind. And there's interesting scenes where she says things like that she's a Venusian, and so he concludes, oh, she's a Denpa, you know, which is basically a Japanese kitschy aesthetic way of calling someone schizophrenic because they're picking up radio signals. But there's also kind of a suggestion of her having maybe as far as like a full dissociative identity disorder, because she literally cannot remember like the day before without triggering the memory. Like there's a scene where he comes back the next day after they've, you know, had a lot of interactions on the first day, and she can't remember him at first. But then he kind of gives her a few hints and she gradually realizes, and it kind of feels like another, like the version of her that had interactions with him then comes forward, and she kind of steps into being that person again, instead of the sort of default unresponsive, you know, unemotional her that she was before, realizing, oh, you're the person I have this type of interaction with. And there's a lot of weird little suggestions about her character just being eccentric, you know, but like one at the end of the episode, this is the post-credit scene, is where the main guy discovers her bedroom, and she's just got this gigantic, gorgeous Grecian bed with, like, you know, the plush satin sheets and everything, and he's just like, what the fuck is this well, at least she's sleeping in, you know, at least she has a nice sleeping situation, even if she lives under the bridge. And then he sees her get into a cabinet underneath of the bed and go good night, and he's like, never mind, she's insane. And that, if I didn't just generically connect to her character on like the level of a Denpa who is oddly comfortable with the idea of being homeless and also thinks that people with a debt mindset need to be stopped, that moment really sold it for me, because I have, since I was a kid, like fantasized about having a bed that has like a fairly large undercarriage I could sleep in. Like I could alternate between on the bed or under the bed depending on my emotional state. And I anytime I have had a bed I could crawl under, I have spent time just underneath of the bed. So I get it. I totally get it. I get why she's in the little cupboard under the bed. Even if it's played like for a gag, it feels right with the way that her character is presented, speaking one Denpa to another. So, you know, this is a case where I think when I first saw this show when I was younger, I would have assumed I could not understand this character, because I used to think that a lot more of what's happening in anime writing was kind of random, that like people are just making up a character, you know, like out of nothing. And I don't really think that's actually even possible. I think because of the fact that every character, if you know enough characters, they all fall into some kind of archetype, and if you know enough people, you have met people who fall into those archetypes. And the hardest thing for me to recognize in my early anime fandom was characters who actually are anything like me, because most of them are presented as women. And I think a part of that is like fantastical projection, right? Like there a lot of anime that just has a generic male character. I don't think you're supposed to see yourself as the generic male character. You're supposed to see the girls as, oh, that's me but a cute girl, so I want to be with her. But the generic male character is the avatar through which you can do that without being either, you know, self-cestuously interested in an anime girl, I guess. Like, but a lot of the time the attraction I see with guys to their waifu is that, oh, I like, that's me as a cute girl, you know, and I want to be with me as a cute girl. Which, if that's how you feel, maybe consider just being the cute girl you want to be with in this world. So a lot of characters that I connected with but didn't see them as like, oh, that character is just like me, I just like the show. This show, in this case, it's really both of the main characters. Like, watching this as a kid, I did not understand that I was like either of these characters. I understood the comedy. I understood the humor in it. But I didn't understand it because I thought, oh, I'm just like this. Because I took it for granted once again that like the idea, like even though it's pushed to this extreme in the show of like pay back all debts, I do have the mentality of not being in debt, and I had never had any debt until I was well into my 20s, and it snuck up on me. It was something I wasn't anticipating. It was, or didn't think I was creating for myself, is a better way to put it. So it was more of a debt that comes from like suddenly having just lost a whole lot of money and then going, oh, I don't have the money to pay, what will now become debt. So I kind of had this like pride myself in like, I don't owe anybody anything, like literally in a monetary sense. I don't owe anybody anything. And I had made, very steadfast attempts that even if it took a long time to pay back my debts. And I used to tell this story about a time a friend of mine bought me like the first 3 volumes of Robot, which is these graphic compilations from Yoshitoshi Abe and Ranji Murata and a bunch of other artists, on Amazon Marketplace for like $60 for all 3. And I said, I'll pay you back when I get a real job. And it took me 6 years to get a real job. But like the first paycheck, I came and said, here's that $60, because that's how like much it mattered to me back then to not feel like I'm indebted to anybody. And it really took stacking up that feeling to like making too many promises to too many people, defaulting on too many promises to, it mind broke me. It made me realize like, yeah, I'm not capable of actually paying back all the debts. Like, turns out if you're really thinking about your, you owe everything to everyone, right? Like all existence is flowing through each other. How do you measure where debt begins? Hey, maybe consider none of that shit's real, and it's literally something you're doing to yourself emotionally. And this show understands that perfectly, where it like the show does not think that his mentality is correct at all. What it does think is that if he can't pay off his debt, he's gonna die because his heart will just fail. Not because there's a karmic balance in the universe that you have to repay all debts or else, God's gonna smite you. He's gonna smite himself. It's his own personal hang-up. It's his own inability to cope with having owed something to someone, causing all of his problems. How do you quantify what you owe to, to the people who brought you into this world? A lot of people hate having been brought into this world and like blame the people who did it. I always had a feeling of like, well, I owe anything happiness I've ever had. I have on some level, I owe it to my mom, right? And so how could I ever repay that debt meaningfully? But at the same time, again, that's overwhelming. Like just to feel that way. Well, how can you even do something nice for someone that you feel like you owe the world? And that's exactly what this show is about navigating. The main character feels like he owes everything to this girl who saved him. And what that means is that there's no boundary to respect himself. Like he cannot tell her no, essentially. He can navigate through trying to like make things a little bit easier for himself, but for the most part what this show ends up being is she makes a suggestion that could be interpreted a lot of ways. He interprets it in the most extreme way and then tries to navigate through how he's going to lessen the impact of what he's agreeing to, but being constantly thwarted by the fact that the situation is just so much more absurd and bizarre than he can really wrap his head around. And so he's always just kind of left at the end just like, sure, whatever. Like he cannot help but to have to go with the flow because that's all that's presented to him as an option by the end. Trying to actually balance a situation and figure out what's fair is more than he can handle. So in the end, he just kind of defers to her like, what do I need to do to make you happy? And she'll just be like, oh, just do this, and then that's it. And it makes it a great relationship simulation. It's a very fun way to look at romance through a lens that in a very clever and roundabout way, like, removes the sexual component, where there's no implication that she's trying to sleep with him. She just seems to want him around, really partly because he said it was a good idea. Like, he said he was worried about her being a woman's, living by herself under the bridge. So by his own standard and metric, he should be concerned about her. And she brings that up to him. It's kind of like a manipulation tactic. Again, it's more about getting him to actually listen to what he's saying to him, to himself and to the world. Be true to his word rather than worried about this kind of debt bullshit. But basically, she keeps ending up, getting him to agree to scenarios that him being like a rich guy should view this as like fundamentally heinous, and a lot of the time he is kind of like, he's aghast at the situation, but he's more worried about the fact that she and the people around her are living like this than he is about the fact that he now has to live like this. Like, he's viewing it all through this kind of comparative lens, because even though he has like a rich penthouse that he could be sleeping in, he's also like, well, what's the deal with you sleeping? Like, why aren't you in the penthouse? What's going on here? Why are you stuck under the bridge? And the question is, like, is she stuck under the bridge, or does she just not care to participate in these systems that that create debt, that create all this? Like, she doesn't have debt. Actually, she's living totally off of the land, essentially living like a cave person, but in modern Japan. So the first episode, aside from establishing the relationship between these two characters, it also establishes the Kappa character. And the way that this goes about is very clearly making various statements about identity, both about racism and I think about transgenderism, which I think is interesting. Because the way this scene plays out is that she says, I'm going to introduce you to my friend. And I have to warn you that his skin is a different color from what's usual. Is that okay with, like, are you going to have a problem with that? And he's like, no, of course not. I work in business. I've met people from all over the world. I have no problem with anybody's race. So she puts her hand in the water and starts splashing. He's like, what the fuck? And then a Kappa comes out. And the first thing he does, he's like, oh my God, green. They're green. That motherfucker's green, And she's like, you said you weren't going to freak out. And he's like, yeah, but green, right? And so it reveals, like, this is the same core as any other racism, right? It's just you didn't expect to see. The reason that people are racist against any other race is a lack of exposure. When a white person who's from a all-white place sees a black person, they have this exact same reaction because they just, and it's not even like he doesn't have a conception of what a Kappa is, because he ends up, as soon as they say, oh, it's a Kappa, he kind of like calms down immediately because now he can rationalize it. Oh, of course, Kappa. I just didn't think those were real, but I do know what that is, And so the Kappa's like, yeah, not a lot of people realize we exist anymore, but we're out here. And so he's like kind of intrigued by the Kappa, and then Kappa's like, if you ever meet another one of our kind, just please don't react so harshly. We are sensitive creatures. He's like gonna cry, and the main character's like, oh fuck, man, I really was racist there. And then as the Kappa's walking away, he notices a zipper on the back of him, and he's like, that's a guy in a costume. And he immediately is calling him out. He's like, that's not a Kappa, that's a guy in a costume. And what Kappa's reaction is, how could you say that about me? I am clearly a Kappa, And they go back and forth like this for a while, and the scene is like comedically making it as clear as possible that, like, this is a guy in a costume. It's not a mythical creature. It is a person dressed as a Kappa. But this person believes themselves to be a Kappa. It is their entire lifestyle and mentality. They're not letting up on it as this is who I am. And it's how the people in their community respect and acknowledge them, So to be kind of like blowing up the spot, it's literally like if you saw a trans person who was passing when you met them, and then you notice at some point, oh wait, this person has an Adam's apple, and the first thing you say is, you're not a woman at all, you've got an Adam's apple. Like, that's the metaphor here. It's presented within the show that the main character is kind of being a dick bag, and you could not take it that way, but the girl's looking at it like, oh, this is tragic. Why are you being mean to my Kappa friend? And Kappa's, why are you being a dick? And it's not that the show's not making fun of Kappa, because, again, this isn't transgenderism. This is a guy in a Kappa suit in a river. So there's a little bit more leeway to make fun of the character for being waterlogged in the costume and everything. And there's I don't think it's harmful, and because it is so allegorical, and because the character is doing something so ridiculous. But the point of the scene is still kind of to reveal that no matter how obvious it is that it's a guy in a Kappa suit, pointing it out still makes you a dick. Pointing it out and laying into it and not acknowledging someone's identity is just going to make that person not like you, and it's going to bring down the vibe of everybody else in your environment. That's the reason to be polite and respect other people's identities, no matter what those identities are, no matter how much you think, oh, well, this person is not who they're, describing themselves as. And it's like, well, what the fuck is a Kappa? Like, what does it mean for him not to be a Kappa? Like, motherfucker lives in the river. I live in a van down by the river. I personally had a point in my life where I had to really interrogate the way that I looked at transactional relationships, where, like, I always felt like I was establishing trades with people, where it's like, whoever I know, there was always kind of a, oh, well, I did this for you, so I'm going to ask this of you. Or, because you did these things for me, I feel like I want to have done something for you also. But, like, the value in those trades is so difficult to determine, especially if it's anything other than money. It's like one thing to be like, oh, I got dinner this time and you got dinner that time. But it's another situation when one of you makes significantly more money than the other person and can just get dinner every time because you want to have that person there. And that was where, like, that was what first started challenging me, right? Like, when I first started being able to afford to take people out to eat with me, I didn't want anything back. I didn't view it as, oh, this is me doing you a favor. I was like, I want someone to hang out with me while I eat, and you can't afford your own meal, and I can afford your meal. So just let me pay for you because I want someone there. And the more that became my view of how I spend my money, the more quickly I ran through that money. And, it started with just viewing my partner as, like, whatever I can do with the person that I've chosen as my partner, like, it's spare no expense on us having a great time together type of thing. And then as that relationship went on, and I started to find a kind of toxicity in that, where it's like, well, do the two of us really deserve, all this fruit of whatever, so many people are pouring into me? And is there not something better I could be doing with my money and my energy? And if I spent this on more people, would I have better experiences? And not long after that relationship ended, I had 3 new friends that I had spent a lot of money, just kind of trying to have cool experiences with these people, and not viewing it like, oh, I bought the hotel, so now everybody owes me $100 or whatever. It's like, I want to be in this hotel tonight. It would be cooler if 3 people were with me than if I was by myself. So it doesn't matter that I paid for it and you're all in it for free. I wanted to be in the hotel. So if more people are there, better. That's the disillusion of the transactional mentality I had as I went through this period. And I did spend all of my money teaching myself this lesson. And I'm, like, oddly glad. I'm not glad that I spent all my money, but I am glad that I broke this down for myself so far, because it took a lot. Like, it took pretty deep into having these experiences before like I like really was able to reflect and think like, if I wasn't spending this money, I just wouldn't be here because I don't know another way to do this. And I have found since then how to do everything I want to do cheaply, because once I had spent all my money, I could no longer afford to just throw money at having good experiences. I now had to really think about it tactically. What are you going to do to earn that experience? What are you going to do to justify, who you're talking to, who you want to talk to, going to the place you want to go to, having the things you want to have at that place, having the people there that you want to have there. How are you going to set all that up? Because you can't just throw money at it. You will run out of money quickly unless you are throwing money at something that generates money. I'm not good at that. I am not good at ROI. I am good at emotional ROI, not fiscal ROI. So I am an under the bridge type of a person, in that I'm going to have a gratifying emotional experience as long as I am around people that I find interesting. And the kinds of people I find interesting are like weirdos and people who don't fit into society. It can be hard for me to connect with a lot of people because they don't really understand why I am on the fringes like that, or how it is that I have like 1 foot in and 1 foot out of being like in stable society and also outside of it. And I've never quite transpired all the way out of stable society. I was pretty close in 2023 when we were doing a traveling job and just kind of camping in between, and staying in random hotels all the time. But like, it was never literally homeless or never literally like living out of a car for an extended period, which I don't even think is a particularly odd way of life, especially if you're doing it in somewhere like Southern California where there's tons and tons of culture of that. Did put me closer to the mentality that like, if I wasn't sharing a life with Bird, that would be my target experience. Like, having a whole house, a whole like area for gathering and cooking and like doing all these things together, like, it's nice for keeping you in a sense of security and stability. Bird has like a normal job that gives him both like an emotional satisfaction from the work environment and also fiscal satisfaction in that, he takes the money home and he gets to do certain things that he wants to be able to do because he has the money. And for me, I want that, but I am so much more loose with what I am entertained by that, again, I feel like I could live a very ragamuffin lifestyle where, maybe I don't have access to as much food or as much shelter or as easy an opportunity to communicate with other people as I have by having constant internet connection and stuff, being in a house. But like, I would get to move way more quickly across way greater distances with very low load, like, it wouldn't cost very much to live. I wouldn't have to find that much money to do what I was trying to do because I'm not trying to pay for a whole house or anything like that. For me, this whole like participating in polite society thing is something I'm doing at like the lowest level I could get away with, which for me has been talking about anime for profit. And even then, it's hard for me to justify. Arakawa Under the Bridge is, I don't even think it's like politically perfect, like the whole Kappa thing maybe could be handled slightly more respectfully. Again, it's a fucking Kappa. It's a guy in a Kappa suit. So it's not like I'm saying that just because it is allegory for something means that it had to be handled like super carefully, when it's actually really funny, as an allegory for anything, any kind of like identity politics of that nature. I think it sets up really interesting characters, a really interesting scenario. I know there are other great episodes and great scenes in the show past this point. I just really wanted to talk about the first episode because by itself, even if you didn't take the rest of the show into consideration, it is worthwhile. And it's not worthwhile in the way that makes me say, oh, you should go, watch a bunch of ads and pay for it or whatever. Like, all the money was already traded. The studio is not even the same place. The people who made this show have moved on tremendously. Like, you should watch this for you. You should watch this because I think this show could make you a better person. It could make you reflect on your own tendencies. And it's beating you over the head with the point so hard that even before I thought I was anything like the characters, I still got what it was trying to say. And I feel like because I've had this in my head, this has lingered in part of my understanding of the world alongside things like that quote I brought up from Sound of Animals Fighting earlier. Their album has this whole speech about living in like these smaller clusters and like how it's more important to influence just a few people than to try to influence as many people as possible. And even though I knew that and believed that, I still operated in a way that's antithetical to that for a long time because I didn't understand how do I be the way that these media are encouraging me to be. Do I literally have to go live under a bridge? And like, maybe kinda. Like, what more helpful position could I put myself in than to take all this knowledge, all this like wealth of understanding of the world I have, and just go be right next to people who need that more than anybody? If I end up living under a bridge, it's going to be because of this show. And if you end up living under a bridge with me, then hey, it'll be a kickin' bridge, I guess. We're all going to end up under the goddamn bridge. That's where they're putting us. All right. Thanks for listening to this incredibly, incredibly long podcast about the first episode of Arakawa Under the Bridge. I'm trying to figure out how to talk about anime in a way that is both fun and responsible to me, where I don't feel like it's right for me to come out and make a video that's like the themes of Arakawa Under the Bridge if I'm not going to watch like the whole thing and study the manga and all that stuff. Like, that's not the point of this. This is like, I remembered the first episode of this show being interesting. I referenced this show a lot also. Like, part of the reason I wanted to throw it on is that I bring up this show all the time because whenever I cross a bridge, I go, Arakawa Under the Bridge X Bridge, because I've got that autism. So I've just referenced the name Arakawa Under the Bridge so many fucking times that I had to return to the show, and I was not surprised to find that I liked it a lot, but I was surprised just how much. And also, the opening theme is still legendary god tier quality. I think I threw it on mostly because I wanted to hear the OP, and I wanted to see if Bird would watch it, but he was way too locked in. I think he was still finishing. I think he was still catching up on Severance, and he's very much into that show. If you want to hear Bird talk about Severance, show up to one of our live streams in a couple of weeks. We're going to really start live streaming, probably on Twitch mostly. Use my link tree to get to the Twitch, and I'm sure I can get Bird to do like a several hour Severance discussion with however many fans turn up. So, if you want to see that, let me know. I realize I've buried that at the end of an hour-long Arakawa Under the Bridge video, but, whatever. Tell me how you think I can talk about animation responsibly. I think I need to cover more indie animators, but it's a lot harder to talk about, like, short aesthetic pieces of art that, I just are like, look at how cool this is, and a trans person made it too. But, if you don't follow, like, Mallbat, you should definitely follow them. Follow Takena, actually, I made this playlist. I don't know if I've made it public yet, but it's called Peak Only, and it's like I've only put the most peak content in there. So maybe I'll put a link to that in the description or something. All right, that's it. Thanks for listening. Anime forever.